The aim of the speech is to reconstruct theories of the image proposed by Leopold Blaustein and created by Roman Ingarden, and to present the dispute between Blaustein and Ingarden about the priority of created concepts, and also to identify possible influences, Blaustein on Ingarden and Ingarden on Blaustein. Leopold Blaustein's and Roman Ingarden theory of image reconstruction. First, objects considered in both terrorist and relationships between these objects. In the theory of Leopold Blaustein, we have the starting point. It is a statement that apart from reproductive and productive presentation, there are also imaginative presentation. The imaginative presentation are the key to explaining the psychology of a man dealing with the fine art works. Theatrical and cinematic works, Blaustein introduces the term imaginative presentation with the analysis limited to objects from the visual sphere. The basic objects we deal with in Blaustein's theory are a reproducing object, that is a work of art, example, painting, sculpture, theatrical performance, film, photography, but also a mirror. And the viewer, the perceptor of the reproducing object. The perceptor looking at the reproducing object imaginatively presents certain objects to himself. Various attitudes are possible. The difference between these attitudes is that the recipient can intend to different subjects, namely to an imaginative object, that is an object located in the image in some particular world, and a reproduced object means to an object that once really existed. This is possible due to the fact that the content presenting the item to us fulfills the functions of its appearance. And so, for example, in the case of a reproducing object, Wyspiański pastel titled Helenka, we can intend, depending on our attitude, to an imaginative object, that is to the depicted girl in the painting, or to a reproduced object, that is to real woman, Wyspiański's daughter Helena, who lived in 1894-1971. And theory of Roman Blaustein. The basic objects we deal with in Ingarden's theory are picture one, that is painting, and viewer, the perceptor of the painting. Color spots spread on the surface of the painting are the basis for the visual perceptive reconstructed appearances. The painting determines the reconstructed appearances. Through these reconstructed appearances, the objects depicted in the painting are intentionally designated and presented. The perceptor, in the right attitude, reconstructs the picture too on the basis of the sense data and constitutes its concretization, that is an aesthetic object. The painting, picture one, is the condition for the existence of picture two, its existential foundation of the picture two, while a painting picture is a real thing, picture two is composed of strata. First strata, appropriately shaped color spots, and the second, a reconstructed appearance showing the item presented, and third, presented objects, objects of three kinds, and object as visually depicted in the painting. A literary topic, that is the life situation presented in the picture. A historic theme, that's a historical situation presented in a picture. Ingarden also consider reproduced objects, that is objects that exist or once existed in reality, transcendent to the picture and no longer being stratum of the picture too. These objects are of the three kinds. These objects are of three kinds and are respectively represented by C1, C2, and C3. Those are a reconstructed object as person or thing, that is one actually existing. Recreated life situation is one situation which exists, and reconstructed historical situation that is once actually existing. Note that Ingarden's painting corresponds to Blaustein reproducing object. Ingarden's object C1, C2, and C3, Blaustein's imaginative objects, and object D1, D2, and D3, Blaustein reproduced object. Ingarden distinguishes C1 from C2 and C3 due to their ontological categories. C1 is the presented person or thing, and C2, C3 are the presented situation. The ontological category is similarly different between D1 and D2 and D3. Ingarden uses the word object in two different senses. We used object to designate object of any ontological category, example, thing, person, situation, and object S to designate only things or persons. The table below lists the corresponding items in Blaustein's and Ingarden's theories. And here is a table. On the left hand, we have the objects in Blaustein's theory, and on the right, objects in Ingarden's theory. And we have here reproducing object and painting. It's a picture one. And color spots which presents content that fulfills, color spots that fulfill the role of an appearance of imaginative object. And here we have two strata, color spots, the basis of appearance, and reconstructed appearance. And then we have presented object. It is an imaginative object, and also presented objects in Ingarden theory, but these objects are have one of three kinds. It's a presented object as person or thing, it's a life situation presented, and it's a historical situation presented. And here we have a reproduced object, that is an object that once actually existed. And here we have in Ingarden's theory, reproduced object, that is a reproduced object as that is once actually existing, life situation reproduced, that is once actually existing, and historical situation reproduced, that is one actually existing. On the right side, we have also concretization of an image that is an aesthetic object, but there is no such a concept in Blaustein's theory. And Ingarden considers also title of the painting, title of the picture. And here in Blaustein's theory, we have no remarks. The problem of places of indeterminacy and their filling in. Blaustein states that the appearance needs to be completed from the invisible side. Usually it presents only one side of the item, the other can be filled out freely. The author considers a situation in which he sees the house from the front and compliments, for example, the color of the roof from the back. In imaginative presentation, we read, I can freely compliment these properties and a whole range of others. And in this way, a whole range of different objects will arise to which I can intend. And similarly, in Ingarden's works, the back side of the thing depicted in the painting is not precisely and in every respect defined by appearance. Ingarden uses the term place of indeterminacy. Both the appearance and the object depicted, whether in a literary work of art or in a painting, have various places of indeterminacy that we fill in and are therefore schematic objects. The picture too, as composed of these strata, is also a schematic object. The difference between Blaustein and Ingarden is that Blaustein believes that the intentional object of imaginative representation is unambiguously determined to me by appearance and is one and only one. There are as many worlds of imaginative objects as there are paintings, photographs, reflections in mirrors. In Blaustein, therefore, we are dealing with one reproducing and one imaginative object. The same Venus of Milo is the intentional object of the imaginative acts of all people watching her. Ingarden, on the other hand, believes that the painting is one and the picture too is one, but as a result of various additions of different viewers, various concretization of the picture too arise. So we have one painting, one picture too, and many of its concretization. Properties of reproducing object, paintings and imaginative object, presented object. Blaustein states that the reproducing object is a real, temporal, and special thing given in perception. And imaginative objects are intentional objects that are not perceived but grasped in a certain act. These objects are not elements of the real world, they only behave like temporal and spatial, are only quasi-real, quasi-temporal, and quasi-spatial. They do not have any spatial and temporal relations to real object. We feel a precipice between them, but they are in quasi-spatial relations with each other. Blaustein was the first to investigate the relationship between imaginative objects and time and space. The Ingarden's analysis presented in the literary work of art and on the structure of the picture are similar. A painting is a real thing produced, created in a certain material given in simple perception. Presented objects, things, people, events, processes are not real, are not physical objects, but they seem real. They are intentional objects, they are not perceived, but are grasped in a complex act. The picture too is a purely intentional object. The real space and the space presented in a literary work of art are completely separate spaces, and there is no special transition between them. It is the same in the case of a work of painting. We are dealing with different spaces. The problem of spatial orientation. Blaustein notes that my body is crucial, central to my understanding of spatial relations. Sometimes something is behind me, in front of me, next to me. In the case of grasp of imaginative objects, the body is projected into the imaginative world. In some way, one is in this world and in a specific place of this world. And one can precisely define that place into which projects themselves is the place where stood, example, a painter or photographer. I'm there, though invisible. This conviction can be found also in Ingarden's work, the literary work of art. The perceiving subject is the center of the space orientation, is the beginning of the frame of reference, and the objects presented are shown from a certain point of view of an invisible person. The reader of literary work or perceptor of a picture too can directly gain insight into the space represented and thus to some extent bridge the gap between the two separate spaces. In the case of a picture too, however, sometimes we imaginarily travel by the image to a given point in space. The problem of representation. In theory of Blaustein, the relation of representation takes place between the reproducing and the reproduced objects. In Ingarden theory, between presented and reproduced objects. When we look at Blaustein's theory of imaginative object and Ingarden's theory of literary work of art and the work of painting, we see many similarities between these theories. As a result, questions arise as to which of the theory came first and who referred to whom, Blaustein to Ingarden or Ingarden to Blaustein. Blaustein Ingarden, a dispute over priority. In numerous statements, both Blaustein and Ingarden wish to demonstrate the priority of their own conception over that of their opponent. Let us begin with Ingarden's statement. In a footnote in all German edition Das literarische Kunstwerk, we read, Leopold Blaustein, a student of Kazimierz Twardowski and mine, dealt with these experiences of appreciation and included them among the so-called by himself imaginative representation. Imaginative representation, Lvov, 1930. This work appeared at the time of the last revision of this book. This book is the Das literarische Kunstwerk, 1931. It is important that in the first Polish edition of this book, o dziele literackim, the above mentioned footnote is longer and also includes the words, I must emphasize that Leopold Blaustein was well aware of my concept of the literary work of art, as I presented it for the first time in my university lecture in Lvov in the spring of 1927. Moreover, in the preface to this Polish edition, we read, the Polish scholars who in a significant but various way referred to Das literarische Kunstwerk was primarily Leopold Blaustein, murdered by the Germans, who in a number of dissertations tried to either supplement some of my research or applied the method of research to other related fields. At the same time, strongly influenced by Kazimierz Twardowski, he psychologized much of his research and considered himself its continuator. What is also significant is what Ingarden wrote in his diary on April 13th, 1933. We quote these Ingarden's words after Radosław Kuliniak and Mariusz Pandura's book. I have repeatedly made bad experience that people to whom I introduced my philosophical views in a friendly conversation later announced them as theirs. And in addition, those who were interfered with in this matter could not remember the conversation about which it was meant. Such was the case with Blaustein in more than one case. It is also worth noting that in memoirs of philosophers who died in years 1939-45, Ingarden writes about Blaustein. Leopold Blaustein, together with his wife Eugenia de Domo-Ginsberg, belonged to the last generation of Twardowski's students. They were also educated under the theoretical influences of Ajdukiewicz and Ingarden. As we can see, Ingarden himself points out that Blaustein was under the influence of Ingarden. That is his own. What's more, even in the first footnote on the structure of the painting, Ingarden intended to inform the reader that his consideration on the structure of the painting were already contained in paragraph 71, the last chapter of the typescript of Das literarische Kunstwerk, written in January 1928 in Paris. That is before edition in 1930 of Blaustein work, Imaginative Presentation. Paragraph 71 was not published in 1931 for technical reasons. Anyway, let us add that paragraph 6972 were never published as a part of the literary work of art, which invariably has 68 paragraphs. Paragraph 71 was published in the Polish Academy of Learning in 1946 and was titled On the Structure of the Painting, a Sketch in the Theory of Art. In the edition from 1966, the content of on the structure of the painting was significantly expanded. What Ingarden claims is that Blaustein works on presentation, starting with the work Imaginative Presentation, are a continuation of Ingarden's idea outlined in Das literarische Kunstwerk. Blaustein preaches the statesman he heard from Ingarden as his own, claiming that it is a continuation of Twardowski thoughts. Blaustein is theoretically influenced by Ingarden and applies Ingarden's solution to other related fields of art. Now let's turn over to Blaustein. Blaustein points out the priority of his concept of imaginative presentation over Ingarden's in three different reviews of Ingarden das literarische Kunstwerk. I underlined in three different reviews. Yes, first in the journal Humanistic Review, and the second in Polish Psychology Archive, and the third in journal Philosophical Movement. In the first and the second review, Blaustein indicates the foundation and contribution to the multistrata nature of a literary work of art that existed before Ingarden's theory. Among these basics and contribution, Blaustein lists the distinction by Twardowski, Husserl, and Meinong of the act, content, and object of the presentation and judgment, and the related distinction between the expression and the object designated by it. Works by Juliusz Kleiner, Eugeniusz Kucharski, and Waldemar Konrad. It is especially important to recall the works of Juliusz Kleiner. In our opinion, just Kleiner can be considered as the proper creator of the strata theory of a literary work of art. In the first paragraph of Kleiner's work, Content and Form in Poetry, published in 1922, we read: the essential feature of each poem is a clear, at least apparently clear, two-strata structure. The whole consists of a set of words and a set of meanings. As a reaction to the work, two groups of presentation arise. The fact that Ingarden knew this work by Kleiner is evidenced very well by the footnote on page 9, Das literarische Kunstwerk. And the third foundation, yes, and contribution, Blaustein's own views. And Blaustein writes in the review: the author of this review, it means Blaustein, tried to render probable the thesis that among the three strata of a literary work of art, the most important is the stratum of intentional objects, determined and defined in a fragmentary and schematic way by a psychologically understood stratum of meanings, also incompletely and ambiguously determined by the stratum of signs. In all of his reviews, Blaustein points out that Ingarden's concept of objects presented in a literary work of art is analogous to his concept of an imaginative object, and that the results obtained by the author on the quasi-reality of these objects and on the time and space in which these objects are located, time perspectives, and the role of the so-called orientation center indicate due to the significant similarities between these objects and imaginative objects, a deeper relationship between fiction and fine arts, theater, cinema, in contrast to, for example, architecture and music. Blaustein is convinced that his concept of imaginative object is prior to that of Ingarden's literary work of art. His theory of imaginative object was transplanted by Ingarden into the field of literature. The attempt at settle the dispute, further arguments. One of the decisive factors in the matter of priority, one theory over the other, is time of its creation. What do we know about it? Firstly, in the introduction to his work, Imaginative Presentation, a study on the borderline of psychology and aesthetics, 1930, Blaustein writes: the content of the following arguments was included in essential outline In my two speeches delivered on May the 15th, 1925 and May 21st, 1926 at the Philosophical Conversatory of Academic Youth in Lvov, and in the speech delivered at the first Congress of Philosophical Circles of Students of Polish Universities in Warsaw in September 1927. This dissertation was established in the Philosophical Seminar of Professor Twardowski in 1926. Unfortunately, Twardowski's diaries do not cover the period from the June the 26th, 1918 to November 10th, 1925. Therefore, we will not find in them confirmation that Blaustein delivered the first speech on imaginative presentation on May 15, 1925. But we have the confirmation that Blaustein delivered second and third of above mentioned speeches, and it's in a diary of Kazimierz Twardowski. Secondly, Blaustein had been dealing with presentation and primarily with imaginative presentation since 1924. This is evidenced in the letter written by Blaustein to Twardowski on September the 1st, 1930 from Lvov. If Blaustein work, imaginative presentation, was ready in 1926, and as Ingarden writes, Blaustein learned about literary works from him in the spring of 1927, then Blaustein's concept of imaginative objects was prior to Ingarden's concept of a literary work of art. However, the following fact should be noted. First, although Blaustein's work, imaginative presentation, was ready in 1926, it was not published until 1930, that is 4 years later. And in the second footnote to his work, Imaginative Presentation, Blaustein writes that some fragments of his work owe more than one improvement. Valuable comments from Professor Twardowski, Professor Ajdukiewicz, docent Ingarden, and my university colleagues, for which I would like to express my deepest thanks here. It is evident that Roman Ingarden knew Blaustein's dissertation even before its publication, and, as we may believe, before writing Das literarische Kunstwerk. However, it is impossible to determine which fragments of Blaustein's work owe their improvement to Ingarden. And third, in the Archive of Polish Academy of Science and Polish Academy of Learning in Krakow, there are 5 documents important to our problem. There are chronologically. First, the conversation about the literary work of art. This is a manuscript in form of notebook dated on, as Ingarden declares, 1918. It is a dialogue of several people about how a literary work exists, whether it is real or ideal. This proves Ingarden's interest in the work of literary work of art as early as 1918. And the second, the typescript in Polish o dziele literackim, on a literary work of art, as Ingarden writes on the first page from 1922. In this work, Ingarden wishes to convince readers that there are a number of questions regarding a literary work. Such question as, is there one work, of example, The Peasants of Władysław Reymont, or is there a greater number of them? What does not belong to a literary work? What belongs to him? It must be emphasized that this typescript contains outline of Das literarische Kunstwerk. Ingarden touches on the issue of strata of a literary work of art. Ingarden writes, inter alia, that a literary work of art is composed of various strata. Among them are verbal, medium, and meanings. Yes, and that's 1922. Second, he touched on the problem of distinguishing the real objects, independent from the subject of cognition and from the literary work of art, from the quasi-real objects, which are only an intentional equivalent or presumptions in the work. And C, he touches also the problem of underdeterminate places. According to Ingarden, features of intentional objects are not fully determined, and there is a certain sphere of freedom in reproducing and reading the work. Although on the first page of this typescript is written Torun 1902, we are not convinced that this typescript came into being in 1922. There is no proof of that in any documents. In documents we find that Ingarden started to write in Polish text the literary work of art in the spring of 1925, not in 1922. And third documents. The Parisian Typescript in German, Das literarische Kunstwerk from 1928, containing the appendix Ausblick aus Kunstwerke anderer Typen, outlook on works of art of different types, with paragraph 69, 72. Paragraph 71 consists of 37 pages and is devoted to a painting, is devoted to a structure of painting. And we also can find in this archive something really special. These are two Ingarden's replies to Blaustein's reviews of Das literarische Kunstwerk, replies that were never published and which Ingarden wanted to publish in the archives of Polish psychology, edited by Stefan Balej. Balej refused to publish them. Ingarden is outraged by Blaustein's reviews. He writes that Blaustein's reviews gives the impression that the concept and the entire issue of a literary work of art as a multi-strata creation were well known before publication of Ingarden's work. And B, Ingarden only systematically developed these issues. According to Ingarden, this is false. That is he, Ingarden, who was the first to ask the questions and come up with a comprehensive original solution. His, Ingarden's concept, is independent from Blaustein. In responses, Ingarden described all situation as follows. Since autumn 1925, Mr. Blaustein was my student at university. In October 1925, I presented to Mr. B my concept of the strata structure of a literary work of art in its main outlines. I have never hid from Mr. B my unpublished scientific concept. Mr. B's reading took place on November 5th and December the 3rd, 1926, so over a year later after our just mentioned conversation, and a half of a year after I have had proposed lecture on structure of the literary work of art at Lvov University. I actually delivered these lectures afterwards in summer trimester of 1927. And next, I'm not saying that Mr. B's readings were based on my concept of a literary work of art. I'm only saying that Mr. B neglected to point out that at the time of delivering these readings, he was familiar with my concept of a literary work of art. And in February or March 1926, during my philosophical exercises at the Jan Kazimierz University, I initiated a discussion on the construction of an image. It took two meanings and led to results very similar to those reported by B, imaginative objects. Mr. B participated in the discussion and showed a considerable degree of knowledge of the relevant issues. Therefore, I'm not saying that Mr. B created the concepts of imaginative objects on the basis of my exercises. I'm only against such a presentation of things by Mr. B, which gives the impression that my views on this matter depend on his arguments on this subject. As I mentioned, Stefan Balej, the editor of journal Polskie Archiwum Psychologii, Archives of Polish Psychology, refused Ingarden publishing of his reply to Blaustein's review. Ingarden called the whole thing, Blaustein's review and Balej's refusal to publish a reply, disgusting. And conclusions. The conclusion is that Blaustein's concept of an imaginary object, imaginative object, came into being before Ingarden's concepts of a literary work of art and a painting. However, it's rather difficult to talk about influences of Ingarden's thought upon Blaustein's thought and vice versa. These two theories came into being independently of each other. Scope of the inspiration of those two philosophers is wide and includes, amongst other, works of Kazimierz Twardowski, Juliusz Kleiner, Eugeniusz Kucharski, Zygmunt Łępicki, Waldemar Konrad, Władysław Witwicki, and of course, Edmund Husserl. Numerous facts show that Blaustein was not a phenomenologist. He did not refer to the results of Roman Ingarden's research and was not its continuator. What's more, he criticized the theories of Husserl and Ingarden dozens of times. Ingarden himself contributed to the recognition of Blaustein as his Roman Ingarden's continuator, as was the case with Zygmunt Łępicki. And that's all. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you very much for this, let's say, detective presentation of the problem of the priority of this conception. Before I start the discussion, I will only mention that as far as I know, there were so many philosophers in the Lvov-Warsaw school that were equally sensitive to these problems of priority.
Yes.
For instance, in his letters to Neurath, Tarski suggests that Neurath gave some of Tarski's idea to Carnap and was very angry. How could Neurath present some of Tarski's idea as Carnapians? Also, Leśniewski was really sensitive to these matters. He refused to participate to any philosophical congresses because he was afraid that some of his ideas would be stolen by somebody. So,
yes.
And as far as I know, the only person who is completely unsensitive to these matters was Kazimierz Twardowski, because it was completely unimportant to Twardowski whether his idea will be published as his own ideas or as ideas of his students, and he writes it openly in his autobiography. And I think his attitude to his own publications justify this attitude perfectly, because he was completely uninterested in publication. And okay, so thank you. Let me open the discussion. Yeah, Peter Simons.
Thank you, Aleksandra. That was exciting, actually. It was a bit like Agatha Christie. I agree, of course, with Anna that there were a lot of, shall we say, delicate questions about priority all over the place at this time. And she mentioned the care with which Leśniewski and Tarski were very, very concerned to make sure that their priority was recognized. I didn't realize Ingarden was quite as bad as that. But Barry Smith once said to me that all great philosophers are really concerned about their own priority. And I never believed that. And I'm completely on Twardowski's side. I think a great philosopher is one who is just happy that other people think about things the same way that he or she does. Because in philosophy, it's very rare to find agreement. And if you do, you should celebrate it and take the person out for a drink rather than go into print against them. So I have nothing other than just that observation to add, but thank you very much for this exciting trail through the documentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Guillaume would like to ask a question.
Yes, well, thank you. That was interesting. You mentioned Waldemar Conrad as a possible influence, and I think also it makes good sense to look at his work. And Conrad is perhaps one of the early phenomenologists who wrote on what he calls Wortkunst. I don't know how to translate that into English. Literature, perhaps, in some sense, where he gives analysis of poems and stuff like this. So it might be, I mean, the influence of Conrad is certainly an important point here, I think, for Ingarden, because it was exactly at the same time, more or less. They were in Göttingen, I think, at that time. So, so did you find anything from in Blaustein concerning Conrad? So did he discuss Conrad, something like this, or?
I found only in footnotes that there is such a conception and an outline of this conception. Yes, as a one of a contribution, but not in details. But it's, for example, in Blaustein characteristic, then the footnotes are really short, and we have only the name, yes, and nothing else, just Waldemar Conrad, and that's all. Yes.
Okay, and Witold Płotka, yes.
Thank you for great talk. I really enjoyed all those historical facts, influences that were extremely interesting for me as a scholar involved in Blaustein studies, so to speak. But I think first, I think that there were influences, of course, of Ingarden on Blaustein, and you were focused on image and this type of art. But if you refer to theater play, so to the appendix to Das literarische Kunstwerk, you will find exactly the same words to the reproducing object, the reproduced object, and so on. And I think that it is quite evident that he was influenced by Ingarden, and this his obsession to justify that he was the first one. Of course, this is the Polish story, but there is also this German story and dispute with Nikolai Hartmann, who was the first one who invented this stratum theory. But I want to also say a few words about backstory of this Blaustein Ingarden, because they were rivals to get a chair at the Lvov University, and it wasn't presented by you, but before 1933 there were many people who wanted to get a chair at the university, and Blaustein was very young, much younger than Ingarden, and he was included in a group of young scholars, including Walter Auerbach, Salomon Igel, who attacked Ingarden to and secured the chair for Blaustein or for other scholars from this group. And later, after 1933, there was no tension between them. I think that later, when the situation was quite clear that Blaustein got the chair at the university, they realized that they have to cooperate. And in many writings published in the 30s, Blaustein indeed referred to Ingarden as a source of or inventor of many topics present in aesthetics. So this tension was at the very beginning of their cooperation, and there is even this text published, I think in 1961, where Ingarden explicitly said that indeed he was my student, but he was very clever guy and he pushed forward my my studies, but at the same time his theory was original. So I think it corresponds with your conclusion. So there were, I'm pretty sure that there were influences, but there are also arguments why Blaustein could argue that he formulated the theory independently of Ingarden, because he presented this theory in the context of Twardowski and his theory of Anschauungen and very early theory published in 1887 in Polish on concepts and imaginaries. And I think that there are some arguments that can justify Blaustein claim that this theory can be formulated independently of Ingarden. Especially, I think that also your juxtaposition of both theories is too simplified. I mean that if I look at the painting, do I see the reproducing object or the imaginative object? You know, and if you're using this simple identifications of both theories, I think you neglect very subtle differences between both theories. But this is only a comment. But anyway, I really enjoyed. Great talk. Thank you once again.
Well, I would like to reply.
Yes, thank you very much. I know these works of Blaustein, and I have I think that the influence of Ingarden upon Blaustein is much lower, yes, than it was estimated. And for example, in some works, we have a citation from Ingarden. We have some kind of summary of his ideas, but I have never seen the text, the sentence in Blaustein where he would write, "It is my opinion, and I have this opinion because of Ingarden," or "I take this object from Ingarden." It would never happen. Never. It is rather treated as a summary, as a, for example, one, I couldn't remember the title of this Blaustein text, but we have such a whole paragraph about concretization, about grasping of aesthetic objects, but we have no declaration, yes, that this is I really take from Ingarden. That's first time. And what to the simplification of this presentation is reconstruction of these two theories. Yes, I omitted the aesthetic problems. Yes, because we have in Ingarden's theory these qualities, valuable qualities, metaphysical qualities, and it is really the clue. Yes, the most important thing in Ingarden's theory of painting, of work of arts, etc. So I try to compare only the objects which are taken, and the solution of the problem you mentioned is like that we are just looking at real thing. It's this painting, And we can intend to different object, but it is something that depends on our attitude. So we see something and we can intend to painting, and we can describe the spots, the color of spots and shapes, and we can intend to the imaginative object, or we can intend to real world. Yes, for example, this Helena, daughter of Wyspiański. So, maybe in some other works it is rather. Maybe in some works of Blaustein we have such influences, but for example, his habilitation thesis. Yes, it was also reviewed by Ingarden, and this review is very strong and sharp. Yes, it's very. It is not a pleasant review. Yes, and yes. That's all what I would like to say.
Thank you. With this exchange of thoughts, we may fluently move to the last paper. But before doing that, I just can't stand without asking this question, you Ola, because it's also a question that I am asking myself. Do you have any definition or operationalization of this quasi, in Latin quasi, when Ingarden and Blaustein use this quasi-visual, quasi-acoustic, or anything like that?
I know that it was taken from Husserl, but Husserl, yes, and Husserl once used this quasi-real in German, once in Logische Untersuchungen. So we have this in Husserl, but quasi-temporal, quasi-spatial, quasi-text it is the idea of Blaustein, and he tried to describe it as there is no real, but it behaves like a real object. It is not spatial, but it could be treated as a spatial. So it's only the metaphor.
So you would agree with me that it's only a keyword to hide a serious philosophical problem.
Yes, it's a keyword, and it occurred also in quasi statements. Yes, and this quasi-statement, it's something like supposition. Yes, a supposition of Meinung. Yes, that is this quasi here, and perhaps these quasi-statements in Ingarden are taken from Blaustein, because Blaustein said also in his first book that we have. First, the statement, real statement, and supposition, and the supposition is considered as related to quasi-world.